Hi, everyone. Welcome to the online Stormwater Capital Improvement Plan public meeting. Thanks for joining us here tonight. My name is Eileen Winquist. I'm an outreach manager with the Department of Environmental Services, and I'll be moderating the meeting tonight. Recognizing the interest from the community, we wanted to host this session to share information on the proposed stormwater portion of the CIP. For the session tonight, we'll give a short presentation and then we'll take your questions. We have received some questions in advance and we'll address those during the Q&A session as well. If we get several questions on the same topic, we may answer them as a group. If we receive a lot of questions, we'll prioritize them, the ones that are going to be of interest to the broadest audience to answer during the session tonight. If you have a more specific question about your property, we may follow up with you about that after the meeting. The meeting is being recorded for later viewing if you have to leave or if you want to share it with others who couldn't make it. If this is your first time using Teams to attend a meeting, the graphics on the first slide here show you how to access the chat window to submit a question. You can submit it at any point during the meeting. If you look on the upper right, there will be a small box with a question mark. You can click on that to open the chat window, and then you can type your question in the box at the bottom of the chat window. Your questions may take a few minutes to appear as we go through them. I will now turn it over to Greg Emanuel, the Director of the Department of Environmental Services, to begin the presentation. We also have Mike Moon, our Deputy Director, Demetra McBride, the Bureau Chief for the Office of Sustainability and Environmental Management, and Jason Papakosma, the Watershed Program Manager with the Office of Sustainability, joining us tonight. I'll turn it over to Greg now to start the presentation.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening. Thanks, Eileen. And thank you for joining us from wherever you are out there in this new virtual world we find ourselves in. So again, I'm Greg Emanuel, Director of Environmental Services, and we tend to do things as a team, which is why Eileen walked you through who will be presenting different portions of this presentation. So today we will discuss a significant change in the CIP, a shift for our stormwater program in both the scale and approach that basically acknowledges the need for long-term capital investments. So here's a quick overview of what we'll cover tonight, including a brief history of how we got here, what is in the CIP, parallel efforts underway, and the next process steps to secure funding. So here's our current situation. A system of mostly pipes that are below capacity in certain watersheds for certain intense storms. It's really an outgrowth of what happened historically. What was predominantly agricultural and pervious land developed into neighborhoods of mostly single-family homes, garden apartments, churches, schools, and retail. During Arlington's rapid development in the 30s through the 50s, there were no regulations protecting streams. Almost 2/3 of Arlington's natural stream network was built over and encased in stormwater pipes. The pipe sizing at that time was based on certain assumptions and what they knew at that time. So this map on the right shows the original stream network in dashed black lines and the remaining streams in blue. Streams and floodplains were filled or paved over and could no longer convey floodwater safely during our intense storms. Since the rapid development and the capacity of the infrastructure that went with it, we have had many rain events to test assumptions. This slide compares several notable historic storms that caused significant flooding. The impact of the storm varies with the rainfall intensity, shown in the yellow diamonds, and then the total rainfall, shown on the left scale. So Hurricane Agnes in 1972, for example, had higher rainfall totals, but lower rainfall intensity. And it caused significant flooding and damage at that time in the southern part of the county. Whereas the July 2019 storm, shown on the right, had rainfall intensities of up to 9 inches per hour, which is why it was devastating even with a lower rainfall total amount. So last year's July 8th storm was really a call for action and a shift in strategy and level of investment from our community. These photographs are a collection of views from various storms last summer, highlighting the significant impacts on our streets, in homes, in commercial buildings and locations, typically caused by systems with finite capacity and the accompanying lack of overland relief. So in response, we are in fact proposing a shift to a more flood resilient Arlington. Most of the proposed investment will be in capacity improvements, deliberately approached on a watershed scale, and delivered in a customized, blended manner using a variety of tools from pipes to detention to land acquisition and overland relief. So that's all reflected here on the left box in the navy color. However, for a comprehensive stormwater program, we can't have that focus alone. The Stormwater Master Plan was on target. And of course, it will continue to evolve, but it calls for a more broad and integrated approach, including water quality, shown in the middle color there, in the middle block. Water quality reflects the health of our streams in the bay, the MS4 permit compliance, and then of course, finally, on the right side there, we need to maintain our infrastructure via an appropriate level of maintenance capital for both the pipes and the streams and the transition points like outfalls. So there's a lot here on the slide. The key thing to remember is this. It's an interconnected system of pipes and streams and hopefully soon detention facilities, all at various scales, that all interact in time and volume during intense rain events in ways that affect both water quantity and quality. So we really have to have a game plan that is integrated from a lot level all the way downstream to the river. So to recap our strategy left to right. Hang on just a second, I'm gonna, my daughter's printing something here. Apologize. Apologize for that. Okay. So to recap our strategy from left to right. What we really try to do with our strategy here is to reduce flooding in the community by stormwater system enhancements, maintain forward progress on the MS4 permit compliance to improve water quality by 2025, and then achieve a better state of good repair, improve our infrastructure capital maintenance replacement cycle as part of that. The overarching goal of the proposed CIP is to promote a more flood resilient Arlington. So in the near term, we have to focus on moving forward the projects that are already in the pipeline in 21 and 22. So for capacity projects, the customized solutions will be both blended and phased. Blended to include detention, overland relief, and in some cases, adding to the system where we don't have pipes or inlets. So being blended and phased, risk reduction will also occur in a phased manner. This is a shift in our design approach. So we've had the Stormwater Working Group that converged on a deliberate approach to change design standards, which then helped inform the CIP. But the context is really important. Some parts of our current system can only handle a 2-year storm, which means, another way of putting that is it's a 50-50 any given time that they will exceed capacity. So the industry standard is a 10-year storm, and that's still a legitimate design approach. But we're going to update that to reflect more intense design curves that are associated with more intense storms and climate change. So at the same time, because we don't have overland relief in most places, we will model 100-year storms to figure out where structures are at risk in that scenario and try to systematically get structures out of those areas where and when feasible. This design approach is also effectively a shared risk model. It effectively draws a fine line between, draws a line between public and private investment by saying how big we will make our pipes or how much detention we will seek to achieve with the public investment. So in other words, we won't make all the private risk go away for all storms, but we still plan to reduce risk substantially over time. We're doing some other things at the same time to make it all work together. So that's including better fusion of capabilities within our department to execute a more aggressive program. So we've established a dedicated design team in our engineering bureau. And of course, there's the Risk Assessment and Management Plan, or RAMP, which is going to better inform our priorities and replacement cycles going forward. And then on the lower left, you might see the federal requirements. Wonder what those are? Those reflect our ongoing obligation with the Corps of Engineers to keep the lower reaches of 4 Mile Run dredged and the flood control structures in good condition. So again, we're following the same color coding. This highlights from a big picture where we propose investments in broad categories in the near and long term, with the bulk of those going toward capacity improvements. So Demetra will hit these in greater detail later in the presentation. All these things will require additional funding for the debt service and to fund the maintenance capital. And the exact methods and timing and who pays for what will be determined in future budget actions outside the CIP. Excuse me. So we're proposing bond funding for the FY 21 and 22 projects shown on this slide. Mostly capacity projects shown in the dark blue, Spout Run, Ballston Pond, and Dumbarton Culvert construction will all go beyond FY 22, and we're requesting bond funding to meet the entire construction obligations for those projects. So design is underway for many of those projects right now, and the timing of the availability of the bond funding, if approved, would align closely with when the funds would be needed to advance the projects. So to make that all financially feasible, we are proposing around $50 million in a bond referendum this fall. And that will put us in a position to successfully bid and construct projects in these areas shown. Another important fact is that our stormwater program is funded from dedicated revenues. It's financially separate from the rest of the county, and the stormwater bond will not affect bond capacity for things like parks and schools. So, as many of you know, we are applying an equity lens to all county investments, services, and policy decisions. This was part of the discussion by several speakers last night at the virtual CIP public meeting. It was a public hearing with the board. So please check out that tape for this important discussion if you didn't participate last night. Equity will also likely be a topic of discussion for the CIP work session on July 9th. So I'm going to spend some time on this slide because it's really important part of the discussion of the community. So let me start by sharing my perspective as a DES director, where I have the privilege of overseeing equitable services and investments on everything from refuse and recycling services, to paving, to transportation and transit investments, to water and sewer system investments. Put simply, stormwater is most analogous to our water and sewer utility. And there we provide safe, reliable, affordable water and sewer to all. regardless of the demographics or geography. So to make that happen, for decades, we have supported the water and sewer systems with a large ongoing capital replacement and maintenance program. So let me take that water sewer analogy a little further to the stormwater system of streams and pipes. And there, we should provide a consistent level of reliable, safe conveyance of most storms without significant risk to life and limb, to enable safe access on the public right-of-way for emergency services, and to maintain a consistent level of flood risk for public and private property. So our proposed investments simply address known problem areas based on both modeling and actual experience. So the inflection point in this CIP is that previously our ability to provide an appropriate level of capital investment was limited and kind of eroding and affected our ability to address the known deficiencies. So at this time, we need to start on that path with long-term investments that will serve the community for many generations, and thus we are proposing bond funding. So there's a lot there. In this decade, our known capacity problems in the system are largely driven by topography that was developed. And those are predominantly in 4 watersheds in the northwest part of the county. However, historical context is really important. Historically, our biggest flooding problems were on the southern border of the county, the one we share with Alexandria. A large flood control project of over $50 million in the 1980s addressed this jointly with Alexandria using the Corps of Engineers. The good news is this: it worked last July 8th. The other good news is our land acquisition policy of systematically buying land and having open space in the flood-prone areas along the 4 Mile Run also worked. And although last July 8th we lost some pedestrian bridges in our parks, overall the overland relief and flooding did not cause public or private losses comparable to the past before that flood control project. I would also note that it's an interconnected system. Improvements such as a retention in upper reaches of the watershed will provide risk reduction benefits to everyone and every system downstream, all the way to the mouth of 4 Mile Run where it meets the Potomac. So this being our first stormwater bond ask, it does at a first glance seem large. But we need to put that in the context with decades of significant previous capital funding in the other areas, from community centers to parks to paving. We'll have more on that in the next slides. Regionally, this is also a very modest ask. One thing that makes stormwater unique is that flood resilience is a partnership, because we can't guarantee 100% flood protection for all storms. Basic infrastructure improvements to the system fall to the government, but there are also steps that residents and businesses can and should take to reduce risk that's unique to their individual properties. And in that space, we try to facilitate education. So that was a mouthful on that slide. This one will be, I promise, will be short. This is a little more of the financial context of where stormwater stacks up. In the last 10-year CIP adopted by the board, stormwater represented just 1% of the CIP. And that's shown at the green slice at the 12 o'clock position on this pie. The previous stormwater CIP was focused mainly on water quality. In comparison, our water and sewer capital projects represented 18% of the CIP, and that's the orange slice in like the 10 to 12 zone. Okay, next slide. This one-year proposal for the CIP that we're doing and for stormwater increases our investments in capital maintenance and capacity projects. It will drive it up to 5%. You can see the slice toward the top is 5% now. But important context for this slide is the little orange block here that says 53% of the county's one-year CIP is funded with previously approved funding. So one of the reasons the Stormwater's bond referendum is much larger than other programs is that the other programs can and have built up balances over a number of years to pay for those larger capital projects. But we were running at a pace of approximately $2 million a year for capital programs. And historically, that's not going to be enough to build up balances for those larger projects. And that's why we need a bond for them. In addition, the referendum includes bonds for several projects that will be constructed over a number of years. And so to encumber or execute those multi-year construction contracts, we need to have the funding available up front. So an example would be, conceptually, we're looking at about $27 million in the referendum for Spout Run to have the funding available, and we need to encumber those funds for construction that will occur through FY25. So that was a mouthful. With that overview and context, I'll now turn it over to Dimitri McBride for more detail on the specific areas.
Thank you, Greg. Oh, am I echoing? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Here we're going to visually translate the and demonstrate the county's critical stormwater and flooding needs. This map illustrates reported and verified events since the historic storm of 2006. And the peak shading that you see on this map runs according to the scale and repetition of the flooding. For example, this more pale pink shading that you see towards the south, close to 4 Mile Run, this demonstrates areas where the flooding occurred for the most part and is attributable to the historic storm of 2006. This demonstrates actually the success of long-term stormwater planning and also the investments in the purchase and enhancement of the floodplains, most of which are below Interstate 50 in Arlington County, as well as the sustained enlargement and flow of 4 Mile Run. But if you go further up, you're going to see this pink area become much hotter, and these yellow pooled areas, these demonstrate repetitive significant storms, repetitive high intensity storms that produced significant flooding and significant loss. This map is important and it helps explain the rationale of the next map. We can move to that. Under the proposed CIP, these are the scale and location of the proposed investments. And not surprisingly, you can see where these areas and the locations certainly correspond to where you have the repetitive flooding and obviously the lack of overland flow. If you go down to the south, you are still going to see two project bubbles, and those relate to the ongoing dredging to ensure the capacity and the flow and the operation of 4 Mile Run. We can go to the next one. This is a summary of the proposed capacity improvements projects under the provisional CIP, and you'll note in the far right this expansion for a projected 10-year CIP. These amounts up at the top track where we are in terms of the planning, design, and future construction of watershed scale projects. So they shouldn't be misread to scale exactly what the needs of these particular watersheds are. As Mr. Emmanuel referred to above, the critical needs in Arlington County now are concentrated but not exclusive to what we call 5 critical watersheds. That also includes Lubber Run, which is in an early phase of studies, engineering studies, and surveys. This next category for flood risk reduction, while we have watershed scale projects above that are going to be multi-phase and roll out over a number of years, this includes single phase projects of localized flooding, as well as the need for additional infrastructure in the system. And this last item here for land acquisition is going to create overland relief in watersheds where currently there is largely or completely, the overland relief is largely or completely absent. These elements combined, again, as Mr. Emmanuel noted above, with distributed detention and other measures and strategies is really a necessary expansion of the engineering toolkit that is required to really respond to and overcome the area's many constraints and conflicts. Next. High intensity storms and flash floods are becoming more frequent in our region. For example, data is showing that in the past 3 out of the past 4 years, our area has experienced 100 to, in one case last year, 500-year storms. These are becoming not only more frequent, but they're seeming to trend and band through Fairfax County, across northern Arlington, the northern section of Arlington County, and into Washington, D.C. and Maryland. For example, going back to July 8th of last year, Arlington received a calculated, and this is from NOAA, 1.4 billion gallons of rainfall in a storm that lasted really only approximately 35 minutes, with double the intensity above Lee Highway. These storms jeopardize public health and safety, other infrastructure, building integrity, and business and economic operations. They generate sanitary backflows that enter our stream network. They flood roads and arterials, overwhelm operations and maintenance budgets, and over time could affect the tax base. This is just a high-level sampling of the impacts the Stormwater Master Plan is charged to address and the community-wide interests it serves. The next one, please. Again, this is an elaboration on an earlier slide. The program does include, it's a troika of programs that are necessary to have an effective and robust stormwater management program. This is the proposal for the capital maintenance portion of that. We are in the beginning stages right now of the risk assessment and management project. Through that, we're going to have a number of analytic studies. It's going to have vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, etc. These are going to help inform a long-term capital maintenance program. But in the near term, these requests here are really based on primary needs that are identified through inventories and analytics, contractual obligations, critical cross-infrastructure assets, and ongoing monitoring of the system. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason Papakosma to discuss the water quality program and the MS4 permit.
Thank you, Demetra. This is the part of the program that works to mitigate the impacts of stormwater runoff on the natural stream component of our stormwater network, both water quality as well as physical damage to streams, adjacent lands, and co-located infrastructure. These investments are also where we make progress towards the pollutant reduction requirements for the Chesapeake Bay that are required by our MS4 permit. Arlington streams have been eroding for decades because once erosion starts, the vulnerability to more erosion tends to increase. And our recent patterns of high intensity storms have further damaged this part of our system and the infrastructure nearby. We have a mix of projects with a range of objectives and co-benefits that are positioned both within the watersheds and in the streams. The projects listed here are planned for construction in FY21 and 22. Next slide, please. Here's a brief status update about our regulatory obligations under our MS4 permit for the restoration of the bay. With continued forward progress on design and construction in FY21 and beyond, we expect we'll meet the cumulative 40% pollutant reduction required by the end of the next permit cycle in 2025. Future CIPs will account for the project and funding needed for the final 60% required by the end of the third permit cycle, which would be expected in 2030. We also have the benefit of our investments at our wastewater plant to provide credits to give us more time to meet the aggressive bay restoration schedule, while we continue sustained investments for local water quality in our local stream network. And finally, the impacts of climate change on the bay are under evaluation by EPA and the bay states, and there's the potential for additional pollutant reduction requirements in future permit cycles. And I'll now turn it back over to Demetra McBride to continue the presentation.
We're near the end and ready to take your questions shortly. In addition to continued implementation of the Stormwater Master Plan, the county has a portfolio of new projects and studies that are exploring vulnerability, risk, and mitigation, and consideration of emerging technologies, engineering design, and policy solutions, as well as alternative funding approaches. Results from these efforts will roll out over the next 6 to 8 months, beginning with this month. Last slide. So what's next? On July 9th at 3 p.m., the board will hold a work session with the county manager on the proposed CIP. On July 18th, the board will give the proposal final consideration and adopt the CIP. And subject to the board's July 18th approvals, the bond referendum will go to voters on November 3rd. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks to thanks to Greg and Demetra and Jason and everyone for the presentation. Now we're going to start with the questions. We've gotten some good questions in here in the Q&A box, and there's a reminder there again, if you can't see the question box, how you can activate that on your screen. Just look for the little question mark and then you can submit questions. So I'll go ahead. We had received some questions ahead of time, so I'm going to go ahead and we'll start with those, and then we have some that we've also received as well in the chat box here. So this, I think maybe Demetra can start with this question, and then if others want to join in. But we did have a question about related to some of the equity discussions about who's benefiting from these proposed stormwater projects. And how the demographics and the values of the properties within the project areas, how those compare with the rest of the county. So Demetra, I don't know if you want to start with that one. And
okay, I just want to make sure. So are we starting with the equity question?
Yeah, that's what I was starting with. We had received ahead of time for the meeting.
Yes, and I wanted to thank all the people who submitted questions, both in writing and last night. And I believe this is a gentleman that I heard last night. There is a much more fulsome answer to your equity question. I do want to state that when we look at the system and we look at the needs, we don't look at a system in a telescoped micro. As Mr. Emmanuel demonstrated at the beginning of the presentation, it's an integrated program of capacity, capital, infrastructure, and maintenance, and also the water quality towards the Chesapeake Bay program compliance. So we have a multi-faceted program with an interconnected capacity system. So I will say, in short, and just in the interest of time, the system impacts that you see in one area are never going to be restricted to that one area. And we don't look according to homes per se. I know that you singled that out because the infrastructure, again, as I related to earlier, it impacts public safety, it impacts all types of buildings. It impacts the environment in several different ways, and it has a multiplicity of economic and business impacts. For example, we had flooding that shut down one of the main metro stations on July 8th. That's a metro station that's not only used by Arlingtonians, but used by people who are commuting from places further away into Washington, D.C. So you have infrastructure, and the stormwater system is an infrastructure element. So I urge you again, and obviously if you require further detail after you've read the written response, which we're going to post on our website, please feel free to reach out directly to Eileen, and me and all, I and all of our staff will answer your specific questions. It's just a much longer discussion, as you can tell. And we have a little time left and a lot of questioners. Somebody asked about the ramp approach in more detail and the flood reduction and capacity improvements. We have somewhat targeted, very critical flooding areas where all of the factors that Mr. Emmanuel referred to, where you have poor soils, where you have undersized pipes, where you have no overland flow, and where you have acute elevation changes. All of these converge, simultaneously to a very significant degree. So the flood risk reduction, when you're talking about single phase and targeted projects, that's what that refers to. And also the system does require the expansion of what we call supporting infrastructure or tertiary infrastructure. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Demetra. We also have a question about some of the permitting for new homes. So Jason, I don't know if you want to start with this question, and then again, if others want to contribute. So we had a question about what about not providing or not giving permits for large homes over 2,500 square feet, or also requiring builders to provide canalization. I assume they mean better water management when building uphill, or better management techniques. So Jason, I don't know if you want to talk about some of the changes to the LDA program.
Sure. Thanks, Eileen, and thanks for the question. Yeah, Greg had mentioned that the program as overall really looks and focuses on a large geographic scale, starting at a lot level down to the river. And a lot of what we talked about tonight is what happens after stormwater is generated at the lot scale. But this question really speaks to how we address stormwater at the lot level. And a lot of our land use is, in fact, single family homes, and a lot of our stormwater impacts are also from the replacement of single family homes with larger homes. And so we have a program currently in place that regulates stormwater runoff from single family homes as well as other development. And at the direction of the county board, back in 2018 with a stormwater work session, we've been working on ways to improve how that program performs when it comes to mitigating the runoff impacts from those new homes. So we've been working with a multi-departmental effort in the county to look for ways and come up with recommendations to improve the performance of that program and really increase the emphasis on water quantity while also maintaining our water quality progress. So it's a strong effort that's underway. We're going to be bringing recommendations through the county manager this summer. And like everything else we do, certainly on the development space, it's a balance with private property rights while we seek to work on the parts of the program that are protecting the common good and working to achieve public benefit. So it's an area we're working on with pretty strong intensity right now to get at one area of impact within this overall system.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason. And again, thanks. These are some really great questions that we're getting, so we appreciate everybody joining us and participating. I did get a couple questions about the maps, if it's possible to get a zoomed in version of the map, and some of these maps are also available on some of our web pages. So we will make sure if you go on the Flood Resilient Arlington webpage, some of the same heat maps are available there, but I will post those as well, additional zoomed in versions of the maps with the follow-up information that we'll post on that Flood Resilient page also. And then we had another question about, this may be a question for Greg or Mike, with the proposed CIP, or also Tyler, if we don't plan for new capital projects in other areas like transportation this year, would that make the future CIP breakdowns more heavily skewed towards stormwater? So how will the shift this year affect the future distribution?
Hi, I'm Tyler Smith with the Department of Environmental Services. I'm the finance chief. I'm happy to take that question. It's important to keep in mind that this is a one-year CIP, and the reason we are proposing a one-year CIP is because the economic certainty right now is just a little bit unknown. So hopefully over the next 10 years, things will improve. So I'd be hesitant to say what proportion stormwater will be of the future pie, But for context, if you put in our 188 million sort of plan over the 10 years into the last 10-year CIP that was approved in FY19, stormwater would represent about 6% of that pie. And I'll also say transportation is primarily funded through dedicated sources. So hopefully that gives you, you know, some context for the size of the program we're proposing.
Okay, thanks, Tyler. There was actually a follow-up with that about the what components the CIP, if it includes also regional funding sources, or is that mainly Arlington County funding sources in that expenditure breakdown?
The expenditure breakdown is all funding sources. So local funding, grant funding, other regional funding. Okay,
thank you. Okay, we had another question. If there were some large-scale developments were allowed in some of the parts of Arlington that have been experiencing flooding, so like a large commercial development, large multifamily, could that large development project mitigate the stormwater issues? So this may be for Jason or Demetra, if either of you want to answer that one.
Could I ask for a clarification of what you mean about mitigate? Would it replace single family development or?
I think what this person, and you know, I think Jillian, feel free to submit other questions if we're not getting at your specific question, but if the large scale development was allowed, would that be able to mitigate the stormwater issues? So yeah, probably in replacement of some of the single family areas. So.
You know, as usual, there's no simple answer to stormwater in Arlington County. You have to understand that we're, you know, significantly already built out. So if you're redeveloping, you're still never dealing with a blank slate or an empty canvas. So you're still kind of really tied to more constraints and possibly even more difficult constraints on your ability to access the main trunk line system itself and do anything to that system. We already have this throughout many areas in the county, and it's just even very difficult to access certain pipes to enlarge them or to supplement the system. So I wish that it were simple to say that if you just changed the land use, that you could automatically, as a consequence, solve your stormwater problem, but still you're working with the existing problem underground and you're existing with the climatic and other factors above ground. So I'm sorry, I couldn't give a more positive answer. I think the good news is that we're both, we're all determined here to find solutions, and that may be one in limited cases, but certainly it's not a panacea.
Okay. All right, while we have you on, Demetra, there was another question about some of the land acquisition, and the person was wondering, you know, how people would be notified if, you know, we were interested in purchasing a particular property. So just curious about that process.
Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to be really succinct, so maybe we can elaborate upon this in writing. But when we go into a watershed, we're first looking at a number of conceptual plans, and those are going to include all of the blended elements that Mr. Emmanuel described, including acquisition of property. That will be an outreach through our real estate bureau once that's been identified in more concrete plans as a strategic location. And obviously with the acquisition of property, and I only add this because there were questions that came up last night, I was happy to hear somebody who suggested multi-purposing the acquired property. And in fact, we already do, and we have criteria that is not just limited solely to the engineering significance of the location and the property, but also to the ability to open up overland flow, create possible detention space, and in a perfect world, we'd love to be able to add water quality elements to those properties that would count towards our MS4 permit compliance as well. Thank you.
Okay. This one also for Demetra, or if someone else would like to jump into. We had a couple questions about proposed improvements in the Spout Run Watershed and Waverly Hills, a potential with Woodstock Park, and what if there were any proposed improvements and when we might be able to begin work on those.
Hey, Eileen, if I could just pivot, add some clarification to that previous question from Julian just for a minute, and then we'll turn it over to Demetra. I would like to just give some context to that development question, because I think it's very important. And in addition to what Jason Papakosma has said, we are trying to enhance our regulations with LDA permits that are required of developers. But the commercial properties and the larger developments are really, as a legal matter, just responsible to mitigate the stormwater that's on those properties. And so it's really challenging for them to go off property and solve these watershed scale solutions that are needed for these overall watersheds. So I just wanted to add that. I mean, they're really confined. They can't really do some of the things that frankly fall to the government, if you would, or to the county to try to solve. So I just wanted to add that context for what we can actually expect from the developments. Thanks.
Very quickly, I think it's a little premature to really, and again, remember these are watershed scale projects. So Waverly Hills, as well as Cherrydale and other neighborhood associations, are part of Spout Run. We have a number of conceptual plans. We've narrowed down to a number of them, a much smaller number. We had as many as a dozen or more. So we continue to work with the civic associations there and have constant communication, and we'll be outreaching and speaking to them and meeting with them, I would imagine, quite soon, unfortunately. And I'd just like to mention that Waverly Hills did lose an extraordinary community asset in George Keating. So I know those are shoes that are going to be hard to fill, but there's good people there, and we'll be communicating with them soon. It's just that, again, we're at the kind of hard conceptual phase rather than the soft. So we're moving forward, but it's too premature to commit to a specific plan right now.
Okay, thank you, Demetra. We also received a question about the county's community rating system score. And the fact that some of the other jurisdictions have different scores than in Arlington, and are we working to improve our score? And I can answer that. The answer to that is yes. We have been working on that with our team to work on a bunch of different areas to improve outreach and a lot of our different components of the community rating system. So we can provide some more information on that in the summary that we post after the meeting, but the answer to that is yes. All right.
Eileen, if I could just add real quick to that,
Sure.
It's hard to compare apples and oranges. For example, if you're referring to Fairfax, one of the big game changers in the CRS rating is open space and green space. So obviously jurisdictions that have more of that have a little bit of a leg up in that rating calculation.
Okay. All right, we had some of the questions that we had received prior to the meeting as well. One question was, instead of doing a bond for stormwater, why not look at using smart growth development combined with stormwater management techniques? So I don't know if maybe Mike or Demetra would like to address that one. But.
I actually want to ask Jason if he wants to answer that. I've done a lot of talking here, and really he and I really canvass over these subjects continuously. So Jason, could I possibly give that to you?
Yes, that's a good question too. And as I understand it, I think the question is, can we address these challenges through the redevelopment process, and in lieu of the the overall investments we're talking about in the public system. So I think the short answer to that is no, but in a positive way. They work together. We have, as we outlined tonight, a lot of challenges at the watershed scale in terms of improving the system to reduce flood risk. And as development happens, we apply our codes and regulations to, if you will, try to achieve at least a do no harm outcome, or if not, even a net improvement outcome as redevelopment occurs. But we couldn't just rely on redevelopment alone to achieve these outcomes that are primarily, the risks are driven by the development we already have in place and that has been in place for decades, as well as the drainage system that went with it. So the development that's happening today and will happen in the future, we need to keep a strong eye on and be diligent about mitigating impacts and trying to seek improvements. But the watershed scale investments that were outlined tonight are needed at a much larger scale and pace than redevelopment can accomplish. And if anyone wants to add to that, certainly please do.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Here's a question possibly for Mike or Jason as well. This resident was wondering if there was a way to fast track permits so that homeowners that are trying to make floodproofing improvements can get their permits and get their projects done and completed more quickly.
Yes, I think that we've had that opportunity in the past. I mean, it's really case specific on what we can do, but we have used damage to homes impacted by floods to request additional assistance. But I would have to say that's really on a case-by-case basis with our Community Housing Planning Inspection Service Division. And I think what we can do, at least communicate. I think they're generally fairly responsive on permits, somewhat in the 2019 timeframe, but I think it really is case dependent. So I think expediting permits is not something we normally do, but it's something we can consider on a case by case.
Okay, thank you, Mike. There was another question maybe for Tyler. There was a question about sort of the pace of the funding and why the amount of funding was requested this first year, and are we asking for more money than we can use in the first year? So just a kind of a question about pacing and the amount of the funding requested.
Sure, and I'm sorry, you cut out for a little bit for me. I had a connection issue. Is the question about our bond referenda amount?
Yeah, the question is, why is the funding so aggressive? The county is asking, for more money than will be used in the first year. So just sort of a question about pacing and the plan for the funding.
Sure. So part of the reason that our request is a little larger than will be used in the first year, and I think Greg mentioned this in his presentation, is that we haven't been able to build up balances over time to then encumber for some of these large construction projects we have. So the bond referenda actually includes what we need for 21 and 22, but it also includes what we need to execute some of our larger projects for construction over a number of years, like Spout Run, I think as Greg mentioned, where construction will go through FY25. Ballston Pond is another one of those examples where our bond referenda includes funding to so that we can execute these construction contracts up front, but will bring us through a number of years. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. That's helpful. So we did want to acknowledge, we received a comment, but I know all the staff would like to acknowledge George Keating, who unfortunately passed away recently. He was the late president of the Waverly Hills Civic Association, and he was just a very stalwart representative of the community and had been working just really in a very faithful way on behalf of the residents and trying to work on the issues there. And so we wanted to acknowledge that he will be greatly missed as well. I know in the community, but also by staff as well. I think we got another question here. Could stormwater mitigation be a public benefit for upzoning? So again, Mike maybe, or Greg. I don't know who would want to jump in on that one, but.
I think this is similar to the previous question about if we change the land use, the stormwater be fixed. Is this a similar question?
It seems so, Jason.
Yeah, yeah, that could be similar. I think they're just thinking along the lines of some of the zoning changes. So yeah, maybe we have covered that. So I'm just going through making sure. I think we did have a question about land acquisition. And does the current plan include acquiring any homes that are currently occupied? And Demetra, I don't know if you want to touch on that.
I think probably when I hope I'm not misinterpreting the question. When I've been asked this question before, generally what people are trying to ask is if we're going to do reverse condemnation or come in and do, kind of a hostile taking, and the answer is no. That's why we're doing multiple concept plans to allow for flexibility and elasticity in our final plan.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. So we did receive a couple questions about some project map of the project areas. And so I don't believe we do have some of the heat maps available now, but I think perhaps with the follow-up we can make some other maps that may be useful for folks. So I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that, but we do see your request for the maps, so that's something that we can work on. Just looking through, see if there's any other. Oh, I see we have some new questions here. Okay, sorry. Okay, does the county intend to address the RL Now article, which touches on some of the equity discussion that we had earlier? And I think we will, as Demetra noted, be preparing a more lengthy response with some of the meeting summary information. So that will be coming. We'll have some more details there. So seeing what other questions are coming in here. Okay. I think we've covered a lot of them.
Eileen, if I could just jump in really quickly. Someone asked earlier a question. It had multiple parts and I left out the response to the ramp. Okay. Again, in the interest of time, if they would go to our website when we post the responses, I'll make sure again that there's a fulsome answer. And if they have any further questions, again, feel free to reach out to us.
Sure. Yeah. And I think we have touched on this. There's a question, is the county going to work with and or require builders to make sure they are managing future flood risk for residential buildings? And I know, Jason, you spoke about the LDA program and some of the proposed changes. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit more. I know we are kind of coming to the end of our time here. So
I'll just quickly pivot that, I think, to Demetra, because I think it touches on some of the work group conversations about flood resistant design.
This is one, thank you, Jason. And actually, this is going to include 18 months of really rigorous and innovative work that Jason and his team have been doing on what we refer to internally as LDA 2.0. When I, in the second to the last slide, when I said, spoke a little bit to the other efforts that are accompanying the CIP and the Stormwater Master Plan, and said that these would roll out, these deliverables would roll out over the next several months. This interdepartmental working group report is reporting out this month. So keep eyes peeled because all of those issues are covered there in a really exciting way. We were able to kind of gather and corral the expertise and just the imagination of all of our departments. So that's got some really exciting things in it, as well as LDA 2.0.
Well, great. Thank you, Demetra, and thanks everyone. We've come to the end of our time here, so I think we've touched on a lot of the questions that we received. Thank you everyone for submitting the questions. There were a lot of really good and thoughtful questions that you've shared. We will be providing a more detailed summary with more information about all the questions that were submitted and that were either prior to or during the session. So we'll be posting some more information and also the video of the meeting as well on the Flood Resilient Arlington webpage. So I think we'll close it there unless anyone has any other closing comments they would like to make. Okay, well, thank you everyone. We appreciate your time and hope that this was helpful to share some information about the Stormwater CIP. So